This episode of Into the Archives was recorded a few weeks before the passing of Jerry Lewis. Welcome to Into the Archives. I'm your host, Jason Wall. This is a show where lively discussions with archivists and preservationists will happen, who will share their stories on saving film, television, and music of the 20th century. It came from outer space. Gog, those redheads from Seattle, the TV production of The Jazz Singer. These are just some of the classic titles preserved or restored by Bob Furmanek. For over 35 years, Bob has played an important role in media preservation and is the founder of the 3D Film Archive, an organization founded over 25 years ago, which is dedicated to rescuing, preserving, and restoring our 3D heritage. Bob joins us today via telephone from his office in New Jersey. Bob, welcome to Into the Archives.
Well, thank you very much, Jason. It's always a pleasure talking with you, and I'm absolutely delighted to be on your program today.
Well, thank you very much. Now, we're going to touch on all parts of your career in our conversation, but the 3D Archive is really on a roll right now, and your restoration team is doing some amazing work over the past few years, and I understand there's a new title going into the restoration pipeline as we speak. And can you tell us what title that is?
Well, when you said amazing work, you got my attention because our newest project just announced a few days ago is William Cameron Menzies' The Maze. From 1953, it was Allied Artists production and beautifully photographed. Of course, Menzies was a brilliant set designer and director and did incredible things on Things to Come and Invaders from Mars, and did work on Gone with the Wind. And The Maze was his final feature, and it was his only one in 3D. He actually filmed a couple of 3D shorts for a Saul Lesser project called 3D Follies that was never finished, and the shorts were never seen. But The Maze was his only feature, and it's quite a remarkable 3D film, and we're going to have the opportunity to work with 4K scans off the original left-right camera negatives, and when we do our shot-by-shot work to fix any vertical misalignment and optimize the panel matching, it's really going to look better than anyone has ever seen it before, and nobody has seen it really in 3D in 64 years anyway. So it's all the way around, it's a very exciting project for us to do.
Well, that's fantastic news, Bob. I'm going to be looking forward to The Maze when that comes out on Blu-ray real soon. Now, I want to go back early into your career and ask you, when did the film bug bite you? How old were you?
Well, I'd have to say I was probably about 3 months old. It bit me early. My dad was an avid home movie buff, and by home movies I mean 8mm, and from day one, I mean, you know, there's 8mm Kodachrome of my mom taking me from the hospital to the car to bring me home. So as long as I can remember, and my memory goes back, I can remember when I was about 4 or 5 years old. Cameras were always there. There were always the lights for the birthday parties and the Christmases and everything. And probably most significantly, and what made the biggest impact on me, my parents bought their new house in the late 1950s, and it was an unfinished basement. And somehow, while raising 3 kids, they found the time to finish off this basement, but they built it as a kind of living room, screening room area. So when you would go down the stairs, you'd have a projection booth at one end with the viewing ports. At the other end was a screen, and my mom had they had a curtain on it, and they had lights, and there was a motor that opened the curtain and closed it. And that was part of my existence from day one. So the bug was always there, you know. I suppose you could say I was born with it. And my brother, Ron, he upgraded the projection booth to 16 millimeter in the early 1970s, and then around 1978 we put the first 35 millimeter projector in, and we ran a lot of shows over the years. I mean, hundreds of screenings and parties, and we had a great time with it. And then when I started to build the 3D archive, around 1995, we added a second projector, so then I was able to run dual 35 millimeter interlock with polarized projection, and we had a silver screen, and it was really a lot of fun, and it was all part of that background of film and presenting and putting on a show. And I was very fortunate, because otherwise I don't know if I would have really discovered or been bitten by that bug like I was.
I read someplace at the age of 12 you saw a reissue poster for This Is Cinerama, and that is what sparked your interest in 3D. Is that a true story?
Yeah, my dad took me to New York for my 12th birthday, and and it was right at the time when it was reissued in 70 millimeter, and they had this image of a kind of a wraparound screen and an audience, and it got my attention, and my dad remembered enough about it to tell me, and then he talked about 3D and about wearing the glasses and whatnot, and I didn't know much about 3D. I think I had read an issue of Famous Monsters that had an article about it, but certainly there was no way to see these films at that time. So that really got my attention, and it was fascinating and frustrating at the same time, because I was reading about all these great 3D films, and there was no way to see them. So that started it.
Now, I'd like to talk to you about your first job in the industry. You went to work for John Allen and his lab back in New Jersey. So how did you land that job, and what was the lab like back in that era?
Well, this would have been around 1980, 1981. I was just about 20 years old, and John Allen was one of the top labs in the country for working with nitrate film. They were based in Park Ridge, New Jersey, which was only about, maybe 15 miles north of where I live. And I went there once just to see a film. A mutual friend of ours knew him and invited us to a screening. And this place was incredible because it was packed, literally packed with vintage film and paper and trade magazines and you name it. It was quite remarkable. And I worked for John two different times. The first time was basically doing prep work, and that meant any time an element came in for preservation or printing, I was part of there was about two or three of us that would go through and inspect these elements and prepare them to go through the optical printer or whatnot. So I got to handle some cool things. One of the first films I worked on was The Werewolf of London, the 1935 Universal classic, and we had the nitrate camera negative. So I got to go through that, and I remember some of the splices were starting to pop open, and I had to very carefully reinforce those so that it would go through the printer. And they weren't even doing preservation at that time. They were striking prints for, I think, German television.
So they were using the original nitrate negative to strike prints for German television. So this is a few years before the big restoration boom in the 80s, I guess.
Yeah, correct. They were just pulling elements to strike prints for sales accounts. And so I did that. We handled, they were doing some preservation for the Museum of Modern Art, and one of the things I worked on was Way Down East, which was very cool because I got to punch the timing cards because we were replicating the original tinting and toning on the film. So I got to do that, and I stayed with John until 1984 when I got the job working for Jerry Lewis, and I moved out to Los Angeles. So it was a great place to really learn film handling properly. I I handled a lot of film here at home, but this was being done to archival specs, and I learned a lot. It was a great experience.
Now, in between working for John and Jerry Lewis, you were a research assistant on the 1981 film This Is Elvis, directed by Malcolm Leo and Andrew Salt. Is that correct?
Yes, Salt Leo Productions was a David Wolper production for Warner's. And that was actually my brother Ron's gig. He was the head of the research team, and my involvement was somewhat limited because I was living in New Jersey at the time. But one of the things I handled on that is they had gotten some 8mm home movies that were shot, I think, in Florida in 1956, and they were in pretty rough shape, and Ron sent the footage back to me here in Jersey, where I prepped it and got it ready for scanning or for transferring at that time.
Okay. Now, after you worked on This Is Elvis and left John Allen, you met Jerry Lewis and you became his personal archivist. So my two questions for you is, how did you meet Jerry, and how did a job offer come out of that meeting?
Well, this was a vacation when my brother was working on This Is Elvis, and we had gone out to L.A. Actually, you know what? Yeah, correct that. I believe This Is Elvis was finished already. And we had gone out to visit, but Ron still had his pass to go onto the lot at Warner Brothers, where David Wolper had his office. This would have been July of 1982. And we went there just to walk around the back lot and see the studio. And we turned a corner, and a car pulled up, and it had the Jerry Lewis logo in the front, on the front dashboard. And I said, "Wow, that's kind of a strange thing to be driving around with, you know." And we literally turned the corner on the Warner's back lot onto the New York Street and saw people shooting a film. And, oh, that's interesting. Let's see what they're doing. Well, it turned out it was Jerry and his crew, and they were filming some exterior scenes for Smorgasbord. The way I got to meet Jerry was, I think maybe the second day or so, I spotted his manager on the set. His name was Joe Stabile. And Joe seemed like a nice guy, and I approached him and introduced myself. And what got his attention was, I told him I was from New Jersey, and he asked where, and I said Clifton, and I said we're only a few miles away from Irvington, where Jerry was born. So he said, "Well, I got to introduce you." So he took us over, and the first thing Joe said to us, "Tell Jerry where you're from." And I said, "New Jersey." And Jerry just took a beat and looked at us and said, "You're from New Jersey and you're telling people?" Okay. So, there was right away that instant kind of rapport with him. And it turned out the timing was really fortunate because a friend of ours had been building a company called the Archives of Music Preservation. And it was going to be a nonprofit organization that was dedicated to saving and preserving television variety shows. And they had just gone through some vaults and found a couple of Jerry's master tapes from his NBC work in the late 50s and early 60s. And these tapes were going to get junked. So we told Jerry about them, and he wanted to save them. And that kind of started to open the door for Jerry to realize that, okay, these guys are aware of my work. They want to preserve the material, and it opened the door. And it took about 2 years of back and forth dialogue before I was able to finally convince Jerry that he needed a personal archivist, and that I was the guy for the job. And that's how it started.
Wow, what an amazing story, Bob. Now, I've heard over the years that Jerry had collected pretty much everything that he appeared in, no matter if it was television or movies. He had copies of it. It could be a kinescope of a Colgate Comedy Hour, or a copy of a Dinah Shore episode that he appeared in, or a Johnny Carson episode. So he had pretty much his entire career in his archive. Is that a true story, or is that a myth about it?
No, that's true. In fact, as early as about 1948, 1949, he had it worded into the contract that whenever possible, he was to get copies of their performance, whether it was television, it would be a kinescope, or radio, it would be a transcription, and of course film. And so, yeah, he was savvy enough to realize that if he hadn't been proactive with saving these things, that a lot of stuff would not have survived. And he didn't get everything, though. I mean, one of the big missing elements, not only in his career, but in the history of television, was the very first Toast of the Town show from 1948. For listeners that don't know, Toast of the Town was basically the Ed Sullivan Show. Martin and Lewis were two of the guests. It was lost. I asked Jerry why he didn't have that, and he thought a moment, and he said because they didn't make a kinescope of it. But he had, amazing stuff from the early years, the Texaco Star Theaters and Broadway Open House, and even little local things that they did. There's an incredible appearance, probably one of the most amazing Martin and Lewis live shows on a Olympic telethon with Bob Hope and Bing Crosby from 1952. And Jerry was very, very smart to do what he did.
Yes, he was. Now, is it a fair assessment to say that Jerry Lewis was a accidental preservationist?
I guess you could say that. I mean, he saved all this stuff, but Jerry was very much, and still is very much, someone that doesn't live in the past. It's what is he doing today and what's tomorrow. So even back then, he wasn't, it wasn't like he was sitting in his free time watching Colgate Comedy Hour kinescopes. I mean, he kept the stuff. They went into this huge building in Hollywood on Santa Monica Boulevard. And that's where I started working, and everything was there, but it was not, honestly, not well cared for. I mean, these things were just piled up. So my job, beginning in 1984 and a full-time job for about 2 years, was just going through and organizing all this and finding things. Yeah, it was fun because every day I never knew what I was going to find next. And, there was some great discoveries. I remember one time finding 3 cans of 16 millimeter prints, and the only label on them was a masking tape, and it said Copa. Put it on the bench. It turned out to be Jerry in 1954 paid a crew to film he and Dean's opening at New York's Copacabana.
Mm-hmm.
There were moments like that of finding these really incredible, rare moments that he didn't even realize he had.
Now, around the same time you were working for Jerry, you landed a job as the archivist to the estate of Bud Abbott and Lou Costello. And as their archivist, you co-wrote a wonderful book, which I have in my collection, called Abbott and Costello in Hollywood. So how did you end up getting involved with Abbott and Costello while you were working for Jerry Lewis?
Well, around 1984, I was, doing the Jerry Lewis thing full-time. But, living in L.A. and meeting people and going to events, and I met Bud Abbott Jr., and we struck up a good relationship, and I found out that they had all these films that they hadn't gone through. The same with the Costello family. Everything was stored in a pantry at Carol Costello's house. The Bud Abbott stuff was at Beacons on Highland in Hollywood. I basically did the same thing for them that I had done for Lewis, and that was I organized everything and cataloged it. So it was a great experience, and the book Abbott and Costello in Hollywood came about because I was good friends with Ron Palumbo, who was heading up their fan club at the time, and both of us were kind of frustrated about the fact that nobody had ever written a real detailed book about the making of their 36 films. And we just had one of these moments like, well, okay, if nobody else is going to do it, I guess we have to do it. The book came out. We got to a second printing, which was very cool. And, we're very proud of it. It's a very detailed look at the making of their movies.
Now, as you were researching and writing Abbott and Costello in Hollywood, you located The Best Surviving Elements on Jack and the Beanstalk, released in 1952 and produced by Lou Costello, and the Best Surviving Preprint on 1953's Abbott and Costello Meet Captain Kidd. That film was produced by Bud Abbott. Both of these films were photographed in color and released by Warner Brothers. Now, for years, these films never looked great on TV, but you did find better elements in the late 1980s. So my question is, where did you find these elements, and what actually happened to these two titles?
Well, that was a very interesting experience because the Cinecolor is a very obscure but very unusual two-color and then three-color process. And the Abbott and Costello films that were done in color went through this very long period, I mean, literally decades, where you couldn't see them that way. They were only shown on TV in black and white. Jack and the Beanstalk had this beautiful color palette that nobody was seeing. So able to track down 2 or 3 very, very good prints, and we mastered it, created this deluxe edition Laserdisc. So the Jack and the Beanstalk was released with Image Entertainment, and Abbott and Costello Meet Captain Kidd was still under copyright owned by Warner Brothers, and they did not have any elements on it. And through a lot of digging and networking, I was able to find the red, blue, yellow separation masters that had been created for Cinecolor's lab in London. We were able to get those back to Warner Brothers, and they actually wound up going to the UCLA archive. And then about 2001 or 2002, Bob Gitt oversaw a restoration of Captain Kidd, and it wound up getting a DVD release through the Warner Archive.
Now, both of these films were issued originally in Super Cinecolor back in 52 and 53. Now, what was the negative? Was it Eastman color? Was it AGFA? Was it a different type of negative stock?
Yes, they were shot on standard Eastman color, I think 52-48 negative stock, and Cinecolor then worked from those camera negatives to conform to their printing process and made the separations, and I think that's when the fades and dissolves were built in and whatnot. Those camera negatives are gone. So the only surviving preprint would be the 3 colors seps on Captain Kidd. As far as I know, and now I am a few decades out of the loop now, but I don't think any preprint material has ever surfaced on Jack and the Beanstalk. So that one is still... Yeah, that one is still hurting a bit.
Now, at the same time, you were working for the Abbott and Costello estate, writing the Abbott and Costello book, and of course working for Jerry Lewis. You were also working for Capitol Records as a producer and a researcher for their Capitol Collectors series, a wonderful set that they of CDs they put out between the late 1980s to the early 1990s on artists such as the Kingston Trio, Al Martino, Louis Prima, the Andrews Sisters, Joe Stafford, Kay Starr, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, just a bunch of great people. Now, how did you end up at Capitol, and how did you land that job?
Well, that was my brother's gig. Primarily, Ron Furmanek. Ron was a brilliant sound engineer and preservationist, and he had initially done a series of releases with RCA called Nipper's Greatest Hits. Ron's expertise and talent for finding lost material really came to light there, because he was able to get into the vaults and dig through literally thousands of reels of tape to find the original master that was rolling in the studio at the time. I know when Ron started working with Capitol, a lot of the session tapes and master tapes were in the basement of the Pantages Theater. They were renting unused dressing rooms and storage rooms under the theater. You know, the Pantages was still running movies at that time. So they had all these backstage facilities that weren't being used, so Capitol was renting them for storage. They wound up shipping everything out to a huge warehouse in Glendale, and then when Ron had to find session reels, there were, dozens and dozens of pallets with all these tapes shrink wrapped, and you couldn't even read the spines on them. So you had to just literally dig and dig and dig. And one thing, Ron, is he never gave up. So he would just spend weeks and weeks looking for the masters, and that was the idea of the Capitol Collector Series, was to present all of these great hits, and not only the big hits, but things that maybe had charted in the 50s but had been forgotten over the years.
Well, very much like Dean Martin's Ain't That a Kick in the Head, which can be found on his Capitol Collector Series.
Yeah, in fact, that's a funny story with that, because I was a Dean Martin fan from way back, and had built up a pretty good collection of all his Capitol records. And he did an album with Nelson Riddle called This Time I'm Swingin', which was a great, great album. And, well, Ain't That a Kick in the Head was done at the same session, but it was only released as a 45, and then I think around 1967 or 8, it was put on a Pickwick album, just a throwaway collection, and the song was forgotten. And when we were putting together the Dean Martin, we were one song short of, I think it was either 20 or 25 tracks. And we decided to throw in Ain't That a Kick in the Head, because it hadn't been a hit. It never charted, but it was a great lost, unknown song. And Ron found the original 3-track master reel, so it was released for the first time in stereo, and I think it was Martin Scorsese that used it in a film a few years later, and then it just took on a life of its own.
How lucky can one guy be? I kissed her and she kissed me. Like the fella once said, ain't that a kick in the head?
It's crazy how popular that has become in his catalog, but it was, at the time of the Collector's Series, it was just an obscure thing we threw on as, a great song and a capper to the set.
Well, another obscure Dean Martin song that you and your brother located at Capitol Records was called 1,200 Miles from Palm Springs to Texas. So tell us how that number was found.
When we were going through the vaults at Capitol, my brother, Ron, found the session reel. Even though it was not pressed as a Capitol record, Dean did the recording at the Capitol Tower, and the whole reel was there with all the outtakes and everything. We included that. That wasn't on the Collector Series. That was on the 2 CD set called The Capitol Years that I did. And I went to our producer, Wayne Watkins, and I said, there's this great song that nobody has heard that's really obscure, and not even sure the Capitol owns it. And we kind of took a chance, and we put that in the set without, really having a full line of whether or not Capitol Records owned the recording. As far as I know, they never heard from anybody.
It's 1,200 miles from Palm Springs to Texas, but tonight it's right next door. For a week each year, it's the old frontier. That's what brings them here.
The only reason, though, I wound up producing anything at Capitol was because Ron was doing so well with the work he was doing, and he had more work than he could handle. He gave me a shot. He knew that I had some, sense of audio and could certainly do the research. I wound up doing about 30 of them, and I got, I think, 3 or 4 gold records for things I produced. So it was a great, a great experience, and I loved doing it. But it's really thanks to my brother that, he was overworked and he threw a few projects my way.
Well, I have a hunch you were a bit overworked as well, because in 1990, as well as working for Capitol, Jerry Lewis, and for Abbott and Costello's estate, you were forming the 3D Film Archive. And my question is, what was the genesis on forming an archive exclusively for preservation and restoration of 3D content?
Well, I did my first professional 3D gig in 1980 at a theater in New York called the 8th Street Playhouse. My first dose of studio apathy came at that time because we were going to play It Came from Outer Space from Universal. And only a year or so earlier, I had seen this amazing original 1953 polarized 3D print, a left-right original 35 millimeter. And it played at a theater called the Thalia in New York. And it had some wear. You know, there were slugs to replace missing frames occasionally to keep the prints in sync, because for 3D you have to be frame accurate. The left and right have to be identical. You can't be one frame out, or you'll go out of sync and your audience will get a headache. But the print had some slugs, but it looked stunning, and it was so incredibly improved from the red and green anaglyphic print that they were showing. It was a night and day difference. Well, I called the booker for Universal to book that same print for the 8th Street Playhouse, and he said, we don't have that print. It was old and worn, and it's been junked. And I didn't know what to say. That was when I realized that, okay, that's Universal. Maybe we'll have better luck at Paramount. And it was the same thing. That was when I knew that somebody had to step up to the plate.
Yeah.
And
well, what was the first title that you found out in the wild, and approximately what year was that?
It was about 1989 or 90 when I found the first left-right pair. It was the film Robot Monster, of all things. That was the first title that I found left-right prints. At that point, I kicked the whole effort into high gear to try to find as many original left-right 35mm prints that I could find. And for the next decade, I searched the world over, and I wound up building what at that time was the largest collection of vintage 3D films in the world. I had 30 of the 50 Golden Age features in left-right prints, and about 24 shorts and cartoons. In May of 2000, David Packard flew me out to Palo Alto, California, where we did 3 weeks of vintage 3D at his beautiful Stanford Theater. A guy came up to see that from Palmdale, a guy by the name of Jeff Joseph, who had been a film dealer, and I had gotten a couple of prints from him over the years, but he came up to see a few of the screenings, and he liked what he saw, and Jeff approached me in 2003 when the 50th anniversary of 3D's big boom had come up, and he wanted to produce an event in Hollywood, the World 3D Film Expo. So we worked out an arrangement, and I wound up providing, I think, around 21 or so of the features that they screened at that event. And it was a huge success. I mean, people came from around the world to see these rare prints, and it was fabulous. It was, the culmination of a decade of work, seeing these things on the big screen with an audience. A lot of industry people were there.
Oh, yeah. You saw Joe Dante and John Landis and a lot of people from the industry at Expo number 1. And I always called Expo number 1 sort of it had a kind of a geek Woodstock feel to it, if you will, in all endearing terms, because I was there, and most of the shows, or perhaps all the shows, were sold out. I did not get to see every show that I wanted to see. I did see Money from Home and French Line and some of the big titles, but it was a terrific 10 days, or was it 2 weeks?
Yeah, I think it was 2 weeks, and it was every day. It was nonstop, and Wednesdays were rough because the first show was, I think, 9 a.m. and and yet for the people that were flying in for this thing, they knew that this might be the only chance to see some of these things in 3D. So it was a huge success, and they wound up doing another expo in 2006 and then in 2013. In some ways, helped people to realize that, yes, these films were well photographed. When seeing original prints, the quality is far better than most people realized. Thankfully now it's gotten to the point where we're able to do this stuff on Blu-ray and 3D DCP. So it's it's kind of come full circle that way, and it's it's been a great opportunity.
Now, since those 3 expos, you've put together a superb team of technicians to restore some of these Golden Age 3D classics. And what was the first digital restoration that you performed at the 3D Archive on a title?
The first one was Dragonfly Squadron. Frank Tarzi was at Olive Films at the time and wanted to give it a try, and it was really thanks to Frank that we got our first deal. It was not an easy task for us. We had struggled for several years trying to get somebody to give us a shot. We got a lot of rejection letters. Surprisingly, people that you think would have been interested in 3D just didn't want to take a chance with it. Finally, Frank took a shot with Olive, and we got that out. And then Frank moved to Kino, and we did The Bubble. That did well. And then we did 3D Rarities, which was a centennial collection of historic shorts and rare footage dating back to the 1920s. And Jeff Messino at Flicker Alley took a shot with that. And that was another one. 2 or 3 years before we got the Flicker Alley, I couldn't give the stuff away. And Rarities has turned out to be our biggest seller. It's in its 3rd printing now, and it's still selling.
Well, that's great news, Bob. Congratulations. Now, after 3D Rarities, your team moved on to restore the 1961 film The Mask, as well as the first CinemaScope 3D film. Now, it was not the first CinemaScope film shot in 3D, but it was released in CinemaScope. That was called September Storm, and you partnered with the restoration team over at NBC Universal on It Came From Outer Space. But one of the most challenging restorations facing the 3D film archive was the 1954 film Gog. This film has a lot of problems from a preservation and restoration standpoint. The studio had an IP with great color struck from the right eye negative, but they did not have anything on the left eye. So no negative, no IP, or no inner negative, nothing on the left eye of Gog. But there was a print of the left eye still in existence, but the color had completely faded on that print. So to get this movie back in 3D, you scanned the right eye IP, which had great color, and the left eye print that had faded color to recombine them. But before you could recombine them, you had to pull the color back to the left eye. You had to bring color back to that element. So what was the miracle performed to get the color back on the left eye of Gog?
Well, the man that deserves all the praise and all the credit for not only that miracle, but everything else that we were doing on 3D Blu-ray is a brilliant engineer by the name of Greg Kintz. Greg is technical director for the archive. He's based in Indiana. And I've known Greg for about 15 or so years now, and there is nobody better for taking these fragile and brittle and deteriorating 3D elements and bringing them back to life. And what Greg was able to achieve with Gog was absolutely amazing. Basically, through his digital arsenal, he was able to extract color from the right eye, which was the IP that MGM held. And the left eye, that was an original 1954 Pathé color release print. And thankfully, it was in great shape, but it was totally toasted as far as the color. There was nothing left but red. And David Packard now owns that print, and the Packard Humanities Institute allowed MGM the opportunity to scan it. We got those raw scans, and then Greg was able to pull color from the right eye and overlay it onto the left. Now, if you've ever done color correction in Photoshop, you know that that's easier said than done. And what's especially tricky with it is that the left eye is not the same as the right eye. This was shot with a different camera, a few inches apart from the lens, so there's differences in every image. So what Greg literally had to do was go shot by shot and find a setting that worked for one shot would not work for the next. So he had to recalibrate it and retest it, and it was literally 6 months on the operating table of bringing that left side back to life. And again, just all these digital tools. Now, I'm a film guy from way back, as you know, but none of this would have been possible photochemically. It was all done in the digital realm, and thank goodness for that. And then what we did was we took these recombined left-right pairs, and we went to Thad Komorowski, who is a digital restoration artist here in the New York area. He went through it and cleaned up all the dirt and damage and nicks and tears and things like that. And I think what is most remarkable about bringing something like GOG back to life, if you were to do that at a post facility in New York or LA, you'd be looking easily at a six-figure budget. I mean, probably $200,000 to $300,000, and we brought in the entire restoration of GOG for about $12,000. And the only reason I share that with you is to make the point to anybody that might be listening who owns the rights to a 3D film. You don't have to mortgage the studio to restore it and present it in optimal quality today. I mean, it can be done. I mean, I would be thrilled to have a higher budget because we'd eat a little more regularly. You know, and we would actually eat really good food, but you don't have to break the bank to restore a 3D film, and that's how we've been able to achieve what we're doing, and thankfully, you know, make a few bucks at it and deliver a quality product. Those Redheads from Seattle was another huge undertaking, and that was brought in for about $14,000. And with that one, we also restored the lost 3-channel stereophonic sound.
You know, Bob, it's just astonishing hearing this from you, what you bring these titles in for, because the quality of the picture and sound restoration is simply outstanding on these titles. And on a film like Redheads, did you come from the original 52-48 camera negative, or did you use another source for the restoration of that title?
Well, in the case of Redheads and several of the other Paramount titles, the original camera negatives do exist, which is great. But we will only be allowed access to them if 4K scans are done at Paramount's chosen facility. And that's wonderful, but it's totally out of our budget. There's just no way that we could afford that. So in the case of Redheads, what we worked from were 2 first-generation IPs that were made right off the camera negative in 2006. And they were done wetgate, so it helped to hide some of the sins on the original negative. But they still were in pretty rough shape. I mean, if you look at the restoration demo on the Blu-ray, you'll see what Greg had to work with. It was an uphill fight, and the color timing was crazy. There was a lot of real severe fading, especially on the opticals, and Redheads, like a lot of those films, had a lot of cut-in opticals. And it were the kind of opticals where they didn't just cut for the fade or dissolve. They went from scene cut to scene cut. So you could have a dupe optical footage that runs 40, 50 seconds, even more than a minute. And the image is degraded, the color is faded. It was a big challenge. I mean, we're working on Ceasefire now, which is wonderful. And in many ways, such a relief because it's black and white. We don't have those issues with color fade.
Oh, yeah.
The whole thing is we're able to achieve the results we do because we care about getting it out there in the best possible quality. And, you can't put a price tag on that kind of level of interest and devotion. We're very proud of what we've done. I mean, I would love the opportunity to have a bigger budget, but the reality of the industry now is, nobody's going to sink $200,000 into a movie like Sangaree. It's just not going to happen.
Well, that is the sad reality of restoration budgets today. Now, speaking of restorations, you are working on The Maze and Ceasefire. Both of these will be coming out on Blu-ray real soon. What else is in the pipeline at the 3D Archive? How many titles do you have that you're working on restoring that will be coming out on Blu-ray in the next year or so? Can you tell us?
Oh, boy. It changes all the time, but at last count, we had another 6 vintage 3D titles in the pipeline. The problem is they're still being negotiated, the licenses, so they're not locked in yet. I mean, they're looking very good, but until that's locked in, I can't really announce anything. We are supposed to do, in the Paramount package for Kino, Sangaree, Hivaro, and Flight to Tangier. Now, there are problems with each of those. Sangaree and Hivaro are both going to require 4K scans of the camera negative from one side, which may happen, but it's still in the air. And Flight to Tangier is a big problem because the only, outside of a print, a single surviving print that the Packard Humanities Institute owns, the only element on the left eye are the YCMs. The last quote that we had on scanning and recombining YCMs, we were looking at about $25,000. That may be a tough nut to crack on Flight to Tangier. But you never know. Things may change. The maze has been literally back and forth for 2 or 3 years about how it was going to happen and what we were going to use. And thankfully, just within the last 2 weeks, a very major player in the film community stepped up to the plate, and I'm dying to say who it is and announce, but I can't until they tell me. I can't. So there's a lot of good stuff coming. So keep an eye on our website, 3dfilmarchive.com. Well, we also have a pretty active presence on Facebook if people do that, and there's a lot of good stuff coming. So if you're a vintage 3D fan, and even if you're not, if you just like classic film and you want to see film the way that it was supposed to be seen, whether it's widescreen or 3D or stereophonic sound, we've got a lot of really cool and exciting projects coming up.
Well, it is a great time to be a classic movie fan from all the great Blu-rays all the companies in town are putting out, and of course the work that you're doing and your team is doing at the 3D Film Archive. Just some spectacular work on classic 3D films. Bob, I'm going to leave you with one last question today here on Into the Archives. For all the titles that you've worked on in your career, what is Bob Furmanek's holy grail title that he would love to restore?
Well, I think because of my Jerry Lewis connection, I'm going to have to say Money from Home. And we came really close to doing it. Unfortunately, at the 11th hour, somebody pulled the plug, which really hurt because I had Jerry Lewis on board. Jerry was going to let us use some of his behind-the-scenes home movies on the set. We had UCLA, the Packard Humanities Institute, PhotoChem on board, and one individual, and I won't mention his name, but one guy literally at the 11th hour changed his mind, and that was really upsetting. So I still want to see Money from Home get done, and I think for the features, that would be my top one. For something that's lost, I would have to say we have one side of the 1939 short, In Tune with Tomorrow, which was done for the New York World's Fair. It was basically the precursor to New Dimensions, except it's black and white, but it was an amazing stop-motion animated film, and I'd love to find the opposing side to that. It's out there somewhere, but it hasn't turned up yet, so I would say that that's probably at the top of the list as well.
Bob, I want to thank you for joining us today here on Into the Archive, with sharing stories on your career and, of course, your background and all the 3D films you and your team preserve and restore today. Your website, 3dfilmarchive.com, is nothing short of a treasure trove of historical data, which I've spent hours reading, and I recommend anyone who is interested in 3D to check out 3D Film Archive over on the World Wide Web. Again, it's www.3dfilmarchive.com. And just make sure you block out the rest of your day. It's just simply a great site. Now, we didn't get a chance to chat about all the great historical aspect ratio work that Bob and Jack Thiessen provide over at the Home Theater Forum, but perhaps we can get you to come back, Bob, with Jack on a future show to speak about that remarkable work. Those Redheads from Seattle, September Storm, Gog, The Bubble, The Mask, and Ape are all available on 3D Blu-ray from Kino Lorber. It Came from Outer Space, available on 3D Blu-ray from Universal, and 3D Rarities on Blu-ray from Flicker Alley. Bob, it was truly a pleasure to speak with you today.
Jason, thank you so much. I had a wonderful time, and I look forward to talking with you again very soon.
Bob Furmanek of the 3D Film Archive. Starting on September 1st, 2017, at the Museum of Modern Art, a week-long tribute to the 3D Film Archive. It's called 3D Funhouse, and you get to see on the big MoMA screen 3D Rarities, September Storm, Those Redheads from Seattle, Gog, and Dragonfly Squadron. So check out the 3D Archive at MoMA, starting on the 1st of September 2017. Check www.moma.org for their film calendar for dates and showtimes for the 3D Archive at MoMA, starting on the 1st of September 2017. Next time on Into the Archives, we will speak to archivist Adrian Wood about his early career as a film researcher and preservationist in England. I'm Jason Wall, and please join us next time, right here on Into the Archives. Feel free to email us at intothearchives@yahoo.com. Into the Archives is copyrighted 2017 by Brody Productions. All rights reserved.
Distributed by National International Broadcasting.